Hello and welcome to The Rest is Just Noise. This week, I'm at the Acoustical Society of America conference here in Seattle. And throughout the week, my goal is to bring you the highlights and the talks that I found most interesting. At the end of it, we're going to put together a full episode with that rundown. But in the meantime, I'm also sitting down for some short mini episodes with the acousticians, architects, and researchers who are presenting in order to dig deeper into their fascinating work. I'm really excited about all the guests that we have coming up, so let's get into our first of this series of special interviews. Ronald Altoon has been an architect for nearly 50 years, 30 of those leading his own firm. He's given lectures at places like Harvard, USC, and Columbia. And if you missed his talk at this year's meeting, you missed out on one of the best presentations I've seen yet. But thankfully for you, we sat down with him for an extended chat about the importance of context in architectural and acoustical design and on ethics in acoustics. Enjoy. The rest is just noise. Thank you for joining us, Ronald, on The Rest is Just Noise. So you spoke earlier today here at the ASA meeting about two topics that I really wanted to dig in a bit more of, which is the importance of context in acoustic design, and then also the ethics of acoustics and what we should be thinking about as acousticians and designers, particularly in who we're designing for and how we're designing for them. So I want to start with the context. You spoke a bit about different cultural contexts and how people respond to maybe the same design differently, or we design differently for different cultural contexts. Could you sort of elaborate on that and talk a little bit about what you brought up in your earlier presentation?
Yes, the subject today was really restaurant acoustics. And so it raised the question of how acoustics are dealt with within different cultures, within the context of different cultures. And as an architect that has worked globally, I found that you have to be rather holistic in the way in which you define context itself. Mm-hmm. So that we've noticed that buildings over the centuries have turned out by different cultures, influenced highly by their climate, by their geography, by their history and craft, by their social conventions and religion, politics, economics, by everything that you can imagine that would inform decisions that would produce buildings one way different from another. Buildings in Asia are very different than buildings in North Africa and the Middle East, different from North America, different from South America. Well, when you think about people using those buildings and people in particular going to restaurants, you have to take a deeper dive into what is the culture of those people. What we spoke about today was the difference in particular between buildings and restaurant buildings in Korea and Japan, where there is a politeness that's part of the convention. And that politeness suggests that people listen very carefully to what other people are saying. They're attentive to that. Mm-hmm. They're respectful of age and they're respectful of seniority, and they respond appropriately. Whereas in this country in particular, and I would guess many Western European countries, there is a me first kind of cultural ethic, and there is a proclivity towards embracing entertainment as an influencer of our lives, as opposed to tradition.
Okay.
And that creates very different contextual situations that have huge cultural impact on everything around us. So in the case of the Japanese and Korean geisha house restaurants, and these are former geisha houses that have become restaurants, it's quite interesting that you find that there is an appreciation of creating a solemnity in the room so that people can be heard with what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
The examples I cited in the United States were restaurants which were intentionally designed to drive people out. The quality of the food was exceptional.
Yeah.
The desire to be seen there and to boast about having been there and to enjoy the sumptuous cooking overcame the pain in being there.
I think the example you gave was a Wolfgang Puck restaurant, right?
Yes, that's right. Where it was intentionally designed, well, perhaps not intentionally designed to do this, but certainly an accomplished interior designer would know the consequences of creating all reflective hard surfaces.
Because it had sculptures and things on the wall.
Mosaic tiles that were all highly reflective materials. So it's being like in a locker room, and the noise that you would imagine in a locker room, which is very difficult. So people would get in and get out in an hour, and they would have 3 seatings, maybe even more in the course of an evening because the waiting list to get in was so high. Well, I imagine there was not an acoustical engineer or designer involved in those decisions.
If he is, he's bald from pulling his hair out by this point.
Well, unless he was a part owner of the restaurant. But it just seems to me that this is an important issue for people in the acoustical trade to be involved in, because you don't want to be used to be one who's weaponizing your craft. Yep.
So I think we're going to come back to that in just a minute with the ethics discussion. Sure. But something that I thought was interesting was you brought up another example in America of it was a country music bar in Tennessee, I think. Yes. And the interesting thing for me there was it wasn't so much a cultural difference, it's an expectations difference.
Yes. You're going there not only to go to a restaurant, you're really going there for the music and you're dining while you're there. Yeah. And so in a way, you want to be blasted out by the music. You want to be in it. You want to be singing with it. You want to be a part of it. It's why you're there. Yeah. The food happens to be enjoyable food. That's great. But you're going there with an understanding and expectation. That's part of the contract.
And so that changes how you interact with and perceive the sound in that space and how you behave because of it, right?
Now, I could have shown another example, which I almost included, and that was a restaurant in a 5-star hotel in Denver, which I happened to eat at about a month ago. And they had recently redone the restaurant because it was too noisy. Mm-hmm. And they had used dampening materials in the ceiling and other places to soften the sound because it was a high-end restaurant and they wanted people to feel comfortable. They wanted them to take their time indulging their meal because their meal was quite expensive and it paid for itself. Yeah. Okay. So there was a responsible use of acoustics. Mm-hmm. But the examples that I was trying to show were those that said this was intentionally done to respect people. That was intentionally done to drive them out. Here's one in the same country that let you know coming in that this was going to happen, and it was okay with you, it's okay with us. Yep.
So that does bring us to the ethics question of what you raised was, and thinking specifically about the Wolfgang Puck example, is if you were an acoustics consultant on that project and were told, I want you to make an unpleasant, annoying environment to get people moving through faster and so that we can have more turnover and more profit, would you do it?
Right.
I don't know. I hope not. Well, I don't know whether or not the industry in general would say no.
Well, let me compound the challenge with that question. Yeah. Because another example that I showed was not a restaurant, but a retail property in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where it was very clear to me that women would not be able to shop for themselves effectively in this property because they were shopping behind the veil. Mm-hmm. in an abaya, and that would send them to London or Paris to shop. And so what I did was I basically said, look, I'm not here to judge. It's not my job as a professional to judge your culture and say I agree or disagree with it. It is my job to work within what I would say, the ethos of your society, accepting your norms if I choose to work here, but trying to interpret them in a way that achieves the desired outcome of the property itself. So in that case, I took the veil off the woman, I put it on the building so she could navigate through the entire floor without being seen by a man ever, and therefore she could shop there as she would be shopping in Paris or London. Well, if one were to challenge that, one would not be serving their client. If one were to reinterpret it, one would be.
It sounds like it's taking quite a utilitarian view to it of if we adapt the design of this specific building that will be built in this space to make it more usable for the women in that area, it's bringing good to them. It's giving them more opportunity to do the things they need or want to do. Even if we can't change the underlying problem.
It's doing two other things.
Yeah.
First, it's saying, I'm not going to separate a woman from her family to cause her to go to Western Europe to shop and to take the time away from her family and come back. I'm not going to cause her to spend carbon points to get there and come back. And I'm also going to find a way to provide a place for women to shop who can't afford that trip. All right?
Yep.
So it is actually fulfilling expectations within a country without violating the religious beliefs of that country. So I'm saying I am accepting your beliefs, and I'm asking those who police those beliefs to affirm that this does not violate them, or I couldn't have built it, and we built it, and it became enormously successful. All right, so it's basically saying work with the options that you have available to you, but do it in a way that's respectful.
I think another question that was raised actually later sort of comes into this, which is also in all of our thinking about design is who are we designing for? Who is we've got our client that has hired us, but who is the real client that we're trying to do? And one of the examples that was brought up in restaurant acoustics was maybe we should consider the waiters as
I thought that was an excellent comment, by the way.
Yeah.
And what I'll tell you is that what I would tell the people that worked in my office when we would go abroad to work on projects, I would say basically, at the end of the day, we go home. And at the end of the day, the client we built the project for may very likely flip it, sell it to somebody else.
Yep.
The victim in all of this, or the beneficiary in all of this, are the people that use the building.
Yep.
And they will vote with their feet. They will either accept this building as being part of their culture, or they will reject it. And at the end of the day, if I am not putting them first, before my client's investors, and before myself, I'm doing a disservice to my profession and those who licensed me to practice it. So I think there's plenty of room for great design, but first build community first.
Yep.
That's what's most important.
So this brings me to my sort of final thing, which is we've kind of discussed two very related questions in ethics of acoustics. What other things should we be asking ourselves? What are the other ethical questions of acoustics that you don't think are sort of being talked about or thought about enough?
Goodness. Well, I'm not here to accuse the profession of acoustics of not thinking well enough about what they're doing. What I am here to do is to say what I think you should consider when you practice your science and your art, because it's both. Be aware of the cultural influences. If you're designing for a particular culture, and it's outside your comfort zone. Learn it. The first thing I do when I go to a foreign country to work, I go to their museums. I want to know what they value most about themselves over the centuries that I can almost 100% believe my clients are not aware of. They're wealthy enough to build projects and hire me and do everything else, but they're probably not focused on what it is that, who it is they're building for. Because at the end of the day, the people that will be there generations later will inherit the culture. And they'll either reject the instrument that is there to serve it or embrace it. So what it is that creates that environment has to be of the culture. Mm-hmm. If you are from India, you're going to have a different value system than you will have if you're from Uzbekistan. It's going to be very different. And my point would be just be aware of it, find the cultural, contextual questions and issues to inform your suggestions and your recommendations. What I'll tell you is that the experience in a Chinese restaurant is very different than it is in a Korean or Japanese restaurant. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of plates. There's a lot of clanging. There's a lot of noise, and there's a lot of helter-skelter going on, and it's part of the culture. Yep. And I'm not being critical of it. So you would design very differently in China or for a Chinese population than you would here. The real challenge is America is one big Cuisinart. We're everybody.
Yep.
We're everything and everybody. What is the culture here? It's a global mixed culture. And that's why we're great as a nation. And that's also why it's so difficult to form consensus on things. So I think when we're doing things in this country, there needs to be a discussion anyway of how acoustics gets brought into the process of design and when it gets brought in. Yep. Because most of what I was hearing today had to do with remedies. And I think it's a shame that a profession that is so important to our mental and physical health finds itself at the back end of the conversation and not the front.
Yep.
And I think the bigger question is, how do you get in the door in the very beginning? How do you explain to people the value proposition of your being there? Because it is a financial value proposition that most people don't understand. And most people ignore. And if the design community itself doesn't appreciate that, then the client community is going to need to.
Yep. All right. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you for your talk earlier. I'm sure we'll hear more from you on all this soon. At least I hope so.
Appreciate your interest.
Thanks very much. The rest is just noise.
You can find episodes of The Rest is Just Noise on all of your usual podcast apps.
And on our website at justnoisepod.com. We're also on Twitter as @justnoisepod.
The Rest is Just Noise is supported by the UK Acoustics Network.